These conversations have been happening for many years now, and some of the subject matters have been controversial, they've been informative, and the difficulty I think with them, and this is the only negative that I can see, is that we're not able to devote enough time to these particular subject matters. So forums that are able to talk about the subjects that you're here to listen to tonight and participate in are very important to Aboriginal people. Therefore, are important to the rest of the population of Australia. I often say that the Aboriginal people are the host culture. That is true. It won't ever change as long as we're here. My people are the traditional owners of the greater part of Melbourne. We've been here for millennia and we're going to remain here. We have a very good relationship with the City of Melbourne, and that has grown over many years. The City of Melbourne has a number of Indigenous staff and staff generally who are very supportive, who maintain a pretty high level of not just service, but communication. And a conversation is about more than one person. It's about many people, if possible, such as the gathering here this evening. There are a lot of things that Aboriginal people want to converse with everyone about. We're here tonight to talk about law, country and cultural heritage. I first got involved in cultural heritage way back in 1988. The Wurundjeri Council was a Schedule I body under the 1984 Commonwealth Heritage legislation at that point, and we had a custodial responsibility for country other than our own, because at the time there were no organisations that had established that were able to look after the cultural heritage of their people. So in their absence at the time, they were around, individuals were around, but there were no legal entities. We're sort of getting to the point now where if you don't have an incorporated body, you can't do anything. We have a book being launched later that talks about registering births and how important that is. Yes, it is important if you want to be counted. Aboriginal people have the right to vote. Since 1967. I was born and I was part of the Flora and Fauna Act. I try not to dwell on things like that too often because I at least had my mother and father with me. I knew who my family was, I knew who my people were, and I knew where my country was. Since then, of course, I've learning family history, got to know that I have many ancestors who had rights and interests in different country other than Wurundjeri country. Of that I'm very proud. And because of that, it has made me more determined to ensure that their rights and interests in their absence are heard and being met if possible. Hopefully that will happen in my lifetime. So I've been quite active in cultural heritage, maintaining the knowledge of country, particularly where the Wurundjeri people are concerned, because that's where I'm living. But that doesn't discount that I have connections to other tribes, other clans, because of my varied ancestry. We all have that, the Aboriginal community, and I think if you have more than two connections, I think you probably can count yourself rather lucky. Some people don't know that they have connection. They're still trying to find that out. Whose law is that? Is that our law or is that your law? Our law is about sharing. Our law is about maintaining family bonds and extended kinship networks, and that is something that the Aboriginal people of Australia have endeavoured to maintain over centuries. We need to have the freedom to preserve that. We need to have the freedom to have a voice. We need to have the freedom to conduct our law We need to have the freedom to traverse our country, and we need to have the freedom to preserve our cultural heritage. City of Melbourne has been probably one of the better local governments in Victoria who have endeavoured to ensure that the Wurundjeri people are able to maintain the preservation of that cultural heritage, and you'll see some publications up there that honour and respect Aboriginal people, even if they actually don't come from here, but were brought here, died here, were buried here, but haven't been forgotten. And that's something that we need to think about across Australia. My name is Margaret Gardiner of Wurundjeri Elder now. I was spokesperson for the Wurundjeri people after my aunt passed away back in 1988, and from that time to the mid-90s was a real awakening for me. It caused me to start really thinking about not just where we've come from and where we were at the time, but where we want to go. With your support, your ears, your ability to help us open doors, your care in helping us preserve what it is that we need to preserve, I think we can get somewhere much brighter in the future than where we are now. Thank you for your attendance. Waminjika Yemen Kundi Bik Wurundjeri Balak. Welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. We are part of the Kulin Nation, but we are the people responsible for the country here. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable evening.
And you could have heard a pin drop as you spoke. There's a number of things that I'm required to do. I suppose I should say I'm Kate Auty, that's one thing. I have it here in front of me in the running sheet. But I would also like to just acknowledge Aboriginal people for this part of the world. And it's important that I do it, and probably that everybody who speaks here tonight does it. The Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri people, Bunurong people, and other people who have over generations and thousands of years enjoyed this part of the world and brought it up and known it and brought their children up in this part of the world, set us some extraordinary examples about resourcefulness and resilience, and they're ones that are useful to us now in relation to things like climate change. But Aboriginal people have always been resourceful, brave and resilient. And they did that in the face of a colonial enterprise that was there to take their language, steal their land, steal the residue of what land was left to them, and steal their wages and steal their children. That bravery is something that we need, I think, to acknowledge every time we place our foot on Indigenous country. So I'd like to make that acknowledgement. That's the end of my remarks, and I want now to introduce or ask Gary Murray to come up here, and I did ask Gary how he would like me to introduce him, and he will introduce himself, but can I say this? I'm dating myself, but I know his or knew his father, and that's becoming something that is extraordinarily precious and enriching for me in my life. But Gary is a member of the Victorian Traditional Owners Land Justice Group, and that of course is something that he's turned his energies into for some considerable time, and also of the Balat Murup Working Group. And Gary will now talk for some time, then we'll hear from the others. So Gary, the floor is yours.
8 minutes. 8 minutes to talk about Indigenous knowledge over 120,000 years and 228 years of non-Indigenous people's history. And what is it? I had a look at it on Google, thank God for the white man's magic. I'm thinking Indigenous knowledge. What a powerful 2 words they are. And how do we use it? Do we use it well? Do we show respect to it? And how do we get this knowledge? I've got a few holiday snaps here. I'm hoping it's going to work. Is it going to work? Oh, go back. Well, I get my knowledge from my ancestors. I don't get them from books much. although I don't mind Google and the internet and all that. But that old fella, his name's Newman. He was born on the East Charlton Run, near Charlton, of course, on the Boca River. And he was part of the Young Bollard clan. Young Bollard clan is the clan that the etched barks that are held in the British Museum. That's where they come from, bought, biggest scarred tree place in the world. And we're trying to get them back. The British Museum have our knowledge. They took them in 1854. And we had a dispute in 2004 when they came over here and went to the federal court. We got done like a dinner, but we made our point. We want them back. We want our knowledge back. That's Pastor Sir Doug Nicholls and Lady Gladys Nicholls. He's the grandson of Newman, the grandson. Newman was a head man at Bort, and Pastor Sir Doug obviously was our head man in his lifetime, to the point where in 1970 they made him Papa Mummus, which to our people means that he's the head man of all tribes in Australia. That was done at the League, the older League, Advancement League, and they basically made him that head man. And obviously this bloke's got a lot of knowledge. He was an elite sportsman, religious leader, and he was the only one ever to be knighted and to be made a governor, and he was made a governor of South Australia. A man with a wonderful breadth of knowledge that's passed down to his grandkids and his kids and everybody else that knows him. We also get knowledge from our parents, and this is my father. And my father was 17 or 18 when he joined the army in World War II, just like a lot of our people did. And they had knowledge about going there and fighting for the rights of all Australians. They went. In World War I, there was a bloke named Herbert Cecil Murray, no relation to our Murrays, but he went to World War I. And he was a soldier who went to the battlefields of France. He was vaporised by cannon shot. Wasn't enough to pick him up and bury him. That's the sacrifice of one person, and many others too for that matter, not just Aboriginal people. Wars are atrocious, and we have knowledge about wars, yet we abuse that knowledge time and time again. We see the wars that are on now. Are they necessary? I don't know. I'm a bit of a pacifist. I actually protested in the 60s against the Vietnam War, along with Jean McLean, whose son ended up being our barrister in a native title case, so that was ironic. Dad's there, of course, on the left, Rob on the right. And I know about my father through the knowledge of the Padre who was in that war. You'll see that Padre in that photo on the top, Padre Roy Wotton. He lived to be about 101. And he came to visit us in 2007, when we launched Grandfather's statue and then statue in Parliament Gardens. And he told us about Dad, how Dad was on point, and if you know what point is, he's going through the jungle with his rifle in the night, protecting his comrades, because he had a greater knowledge about the bush and the jungle than his soldier mates. He looked after them. And that Padre had such a wonderful wealth of knowledge about that time. He told me about how my father always volunteered not only for the point thing, but also to bury the dead, because Dad respected the dead, respected the living. That was one of his golden principles. And he would make sure the Japanese and Australians were picked up, and a lot of these guys were cut to pieces with Gatling guns. And the Padre said that Dad was always the first one to volunteer for the burial parties. And he continued that through his life when he came back too. Our connection to country is our knowledge. Always has been, always will be. You have to know who you are. particularly our people. This is my family tree, and I go back through my mother and my father to a particular country. We go to, if I were to walk from Wagga to the Alps, I'd go Wurundjeri, Judaroa. I'd have to get a permit from Margaret here, across Waveroo country, to give me the white feather. Then I'd get into the Auty country, walk down there, walk along the river to Barapparap, to Wamba Wamba, and then go south to Jar Jar Rung, and then west to Japagolk and Wirragaya. That's my country. That's my knowledge about who I am, who my ancestors are, and who my kids are, and who my future generations will be. That doesn't change. We are not Japanese. We are not English. We are not from America. We're from those areas in particular. That's our knowledge. That's the bit of the connection part. If I roll my family tree out, I did bring it actually, Margaret, it's in that bag there. If I roll it out, it'll probably go to that wall up there. I'm not going to do that because somebody's got to roll it up, that's for sure. But that is basically, that was 97. Based on our own knowledge, we developed it and we started it. We haven't finished it yet though. We've got a long way to go on that one. Someone better grab that because it will unroll itself. It's got a life of its own. So, in this business that we call Connection to Country, and I've got to thank my comrade here, Rod Hagen, anthropologist. They're not all storytellers and liars. He actually trained us pretty good to find stuff, and we do find stuff. We do research, and we've got this saying, one word, one sentence, a page, etc., can change your life. Can change your life about who you are and where you're connected and where you are on this globe. They say we don't have a written language. Give me a break. Possum skin cloak, that is. That's a nugatuck. A nugatuck is a wamba wamba possum skin cloak. Those two message sticks are my father's message sticks, and they mean something to us. And possum skin cloak only keeps you warm if you're up in the snow country or out in the bush somewhere. They also tell your story. They give you that knowledge about your boundaries, your country, the biodiversity, the water and the land and your people. Our knowledge, we all got prior knowledge about sovereignty, so why haven't we resolved it? We've all got knowledge about what's going on in country, landscape, waterscape. We know that water's precious. You've got to pay for it now. Sometimes water's worth more than the land that you buy. And we've got all those things about that are listed. Yet what do we do about it? How do we use the knowledge about this stuff to resolve this goddamn baggage from Captain Cook to Governor Phillip to our dispossession, our dispersal, our deculturalisation, our loss of languages? We're trying to reconstruct our communities based on our knowledge, and I don't think that we're addressing the real issues. That's probably why sovereignty is on the top of the list. Our knowledge comes from our First Nations, 270 odd language groups. A lot of that knowledge has been documented. A lot of the language has been documented. Unfortunately, in Southeast Australia, this is us, 38 First Nations, with country, with ancestors, with descendant clans today, with traditions and customs, cultural heritage, art and craft, all those wonderful things that make up a nation. And today we've got 6, 7 languages that have been reconstructed in terms of a dictionary only. This is part of the deculturalisation, the part of taking our knowledge and disappearing it. the British Museum, our favourite people, good people there, they've taken a hell of a lot of stuff around the world. They've taken a lot of people's knowledge, the Greeks, the Ethiopians, Indian Americans, us. And just to give you an example, this is an etched smoked bark from Bort, from that old fella that I showed you at the start. The British Museum say it's a nice corroboree scene. They've held this bark since 1854, and that's how they describe it. That's how they've grabbed our knowledge and give it an interpretation. That's a sketch of the same bark. It's a ceremonial one, a men's ritual initiation, sacred to men only. Yet we have women handling those artefacts in the British Museum and even in Australia. That's what they do with our knowledge. They twist it and they try to disappear it. This is the best one. The British Museum says this is a kangaroo hunting scene. Well, sorry, British Museum, it's not. It's a sovereign territorial scene where our people at Bort didn't spear the kangaroo. Have a good look. You look at that. Those two guys down the bottom here are troopers. Don't know whether they're native police, but I think they might have a spear in their head. Both of them. And I think they might be dead too. So I don't think it's a kangaroo scene. Again, this is grabbing our knowledge and misinterpreting who we are. That bark represents evidence about our sovereignty. That bark talks about how we protected our country against intruders, against people who broke customary law, people who went on our country and hunted without permission. They copped it. Well, as I've said, our knowledge is connected to our country and all our stuff. All the rock art, if you look at rock art up at Mudgegonga or rock art down in Garrawood, you will see that our knowledge is in those rocks, as it is in scarred trees and in the middens and the artefacts and all that wonderful cultural heritage out there. The state government's registered something like 35,000 plus heritage sites. They're not protecting them. They're not protecting burial grounds, let alone artefacts and middens and artefact scatters and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's a real problem because that's just exploiting our knowledge and destroying the evidence. Well, it is Reconciliation Week, so I've got to mention that word, eh? Well, I don't know what you guys think, but reconciliation to me is a bit like an accounting definition. It's about balancing the books. Balancing the books. And I think we're in the red. I think we're in the red. Because we need to balance it in terms of sovereignty. We need to balance it in terms of a treaty. And also reparations, that is the ongoing compensation stuff, because of the impact that is continuing on our people. We had a young girl, 15 years of age last week, who committed suicide, cut her wrists in Mildura, a community that gets millions of dollars a year for Aboriginal programs, and that is still happening. And she's not the first one. She's not the second or the third or the fourth either. And I think that's just a snapshot of what's still going on out there. I think we've got to reconcile our shared knowledge. It's a bit like a crime scene. We've all got prior knowledge of what's happened over 200 years. We've also got knowledge that goes back 40,000, 120,000 years, depending upon how far they dig. we get older, the more they dig, the older we get. But I don't think we can deal with the question of addressing our justice, our land justice, our social justice, our economic justice, until we address the issue of sovereignty and treaty and reparations. And I think the debate about recognition is a furphy. I don't support it. My clans don't support it. I don't see any benefit in it. That might make a few politicians feel good that they've done something for blackfellas, but I don't believe that we should be supporting it. I think the debate is about sovereignty and not recognition. And my old grandfather, Doug Nichols, used to say that you can play a tune on the black notes of the piano, you can play a tune on the white notes of a piano, but to get harmony, you need to play both. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you, Gary. Your next speaker is Kerry Arabena, Professor Kerry Arabena, Miriam woman from the Murray Islands, who's here tonight to talk to us about these issues of knowledge and health and her work. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you very much. It is so good to see so many of us joined together here to hear about Indigenous knowledges during this week, Reconciliation Week. I just want to say personally a very warm and sincere thank you all for making the time in your very busy lives. And I would also then like to take this wonderful opportunity to thank very much the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, Aunty Margaret, for your very warm welcome, and all of us who are here who represent the very many nations who make up this one nation of Australia. And I want to acknowledge all of our First Peoples. I have had the chance to live in Aboriginal people's country for my whole life. I'm a Torres Strait Islander whose family were relocated as a result of the Second World War and ended up on the mainland, which in Torres Strait Islander terms is actually the largest island of the Torres Straits. But we have had, myself and my family have had wonderful opportunities to engage with and live with and share the lives of many Aboriginal peoples across all different parts of this country. And to them I've learnt so much, and I extend a debt of gratitude to all of you who've had the opportunity to shape and inform my life. I'd also like to acknowledge other elders who have given so much of their time and their knowledge and their generosity of spirit to the University of Melbourne and to the University of Melbourne community, including the students who come from all over the world to participate there. And they have made that strong engagement with us because they do not want their children or their grandchildren to experience the kind of discrimination that they themselves experienced. And so they are working very, very hard in a very committed way to ensure that that never happens again, not on their watch, not within their time. Whilst I'm here at the moment through the University of Melbourne, I've also had the opportunity to, at the age of 21, run the most remote area Aboriginal medical service in Australia, the Pindaby Homelands Health Service. I've had the chance to be the CEO of Apanipama, the Cape York Health Council. I've had the chance to look after all of the collections that Gary was talking about at IATSIS, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. I was one of the inaugural co-chairs for the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, so I take the right to representation and the right to voice and the right to freedom to determine what that voice needs to say when it needs to be said very, very seriously. I've also been the CEO of the Wurundjeri Institute, which really is embarking on doing the research that we want to do, when we want to do it, with whom we choose to do that with. And I'm currently a director of the Indigenous Community Volunteers, which takes over 2,000 volunteers from all walks of life across Australia and partners with remote area Aboriginal communities, about 175 of them, with a whole range of different programs. And so I think that the issues that we're talking about tonight are about voice, are about name and the right to a name, are about the right to relationships. And Indigenous knowledges in this context then give rise to all of those things through holistic relationships. I actually believe that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this country wrote how primary health care is being delivered around the entire world through the Alma-Ata Declaration. And you can see in there that holistic relationships between kin, between service providers, the right to govern, the right to have your own service, the right to be met by your own staff, the right to communicate with others in language, the right to traditional knowledge holders and participating in community healing programs is something that I believe has had a worldwide impact. And I think that knowledges are not only important for us as knowledge holders, but is enormously influential across the world. One of the pieces of work that I'm really enjoying seeing happening here in Victoria is a reintroduction, a reinstatement of those ceremonial obligations around being in ceremony to help facilitate those transitions at various points of life. That is in fact a very, very precious thing, would probably help, I believe, stop some of those suicides that are happening in communities where people have a rite of passage and they are known differently within the context of their community, and that is held very close within that community. And I think that we would help to address a lot of the disparities by implementing and living by the creed that has been set by our Indigenous knowledges, that there are some that are sacred and secret. There are different levels of knowledge and of different knowledge holders. They are men and women who have very different roles to play in terms of cultural connectedness and responsibilities to your different generations. And there is an enormous amount of respect between men and women. We are not all about flogging up our husbands or wives. We are not all about the kind of violence that is out there in mainstream society. We are strong, resilient, hardworking people who are doing all that we can to hold our communities together in the face of the most atrocious kinds of colonial practices that have obliterated many, but we are not fallen. We are stronger together because of it. I think the same can be said about the many people who want to be given the same opportunity in this country without being made the same. And for that reason, I believe that Indigenous knowledges for us is actually going to be the mainstay of the next 60,000 years of our working and living our lives in Australia and the world. Aboriginal medical services to me have been an absolute front runner for a lot of other Aboriginal community controlled organisations. They have delivered strong governance. They have provided the highest employment opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They are often founded on the principles and values and ethics that are consistent with and inherent within local community contexts. Many of us engage in Indigenous methodologies around two-way learning, so we acknowledge that people do have something really powerful to bring to our communities, but we actually have something that can touch your lives in a very deep way as well. And I believe, and I think that my brother here, Ruben's going to talk some more around this, is that notion of care for country. It's a principle, but it doesn't only belong to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or any Indigenous peoples. There are too many things happening in the 21st century which make me believe that care for country is a principle that needs to be the central tenet of living for the 6 billion people around the planet. And how are we going to make that happen for each and every one of us? That is the only game in town. And rectifying that, I think, will rectify so many different things for us as a species, as peoples and as nations. Country doesn't discriminate, people do. And I have seen time and again a range of articles contained in the UN declarations. We leave it as an aspirational document. We actually, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, have a role and a responsibility to live every single article in that declaration to the best of our ability every single day of our lives. We don't need to ask anyone permission to do that. We just need to do it. And that's what I think will really capture what Indigenous knowledges is and how we can make that real. I am seeing it in different areas. Brother Gary here talked about reconciliation as between peoples. I believe that that is a legitimate process and one in which we will all engage with to improve our country for ourselves. But the next phase of reconciliation is reconciling all of us with the ecosystems in which we live, and to really take that care for country principle to the next level. I'm seeing it happening with regenerative farmers who are opening up their great big swaths of land to traditional owner groups who are coming in and doing cold country burning to diversify the grass sources. They're accessing scar trees. They are actually co-managing country on private land, which is a really extraordinary thing. I also see an enormous amount of evidence in the health field about people's access to traditional countries, traditional food sources, traditional exercising regimes, traditional ways of living, and guess what? They are blowing diabetes out of the water in 6 weeks' period of time. This is unbelievable, but it is because we are back in living in the way that we need to. I also know that if you have access to your own language, then you have the capacity to reduce drug and risk-taking, and that what it does is build strong identities and strong resilience among our peoples. And so I agree with Gary here. Unfortunately, out of the 270 language groups and nations of people, we have the Guinness Book of World Records placeholder as the continent upon which most languages have been lost anywhere else in the world. From 270, I think we now have 17 that are spoken fluently. And I believe that language, country, culture absolutely contributes to our health and well-being. Thank you, I'll leave it there.
I'd like to say to Jeff Taylor, you try containing these wonderful speakers to 8 minutes. I'm not going to. Rueben Berg, who's a Gunditjmara man and who's a graduate architect, is now going to talk to us again. Come, Rueben.
Thanks very much, Kate. As Kate said, my name's Rueben Berg. I'm a Gunditjmara man. My family on my dad's side comes from Framlingham, which is down near Warrnambool. And as a Gunditjmara man, it's really important to me to recognise that this is not my country where we are here today, that this is the country of the people of the Wurundjeri people and the Boonwurrung people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to really extend that to Aunty Margaret for that kind welcome at the start. I'd like to pay my respects to the other people up on this panel here as well. My background is in architecture, and Kate thankfully pointed out that I'm not actually an architect. I'm a graduate architect. The Institute of Architects come and rap me on my knuckles if I say I'm an architect when I'm really not. But I'm just a graduate architect. And in my time studying architecture, I learnt a lot of different things. Some useful in the work I do, and some useful in just being a dad. Some of the stuff wasn't as useful as I would have thought. I learnt a lot about how to do collages, which is useful with my son. I learnt a lot about making models, which is good for building cubby houses and those sorts of things. But one of the key things that I did learn as studying architecture was the importance of place. And that's really one of the things that I spend a lot of my time nowadays focused on, this idea of place, and in particular relevant for today's conversations, this idea of Indigenous knowledge around place. And what I wanted to kind of just talk briefly about this evening was the different forms that Indigenous knowledge about place actually takes, the different ways that we obtain that knowledge, how we obtained it in the past and how we obtain it today, and then also the different ways that we may well celebrate and recognise that knowledge around place. And so in terms of Indigenous knowledge around place, there are lots of different forms that it does take. And there is so much knowledge out there, but some of the key things I've noticed in my time around place and in Indigenous knowledge around it is the specifics around place of what happens over times of the year, what happens in the seasons. And it's one of the key things that we're starting to thankfully celebrate more and more. And there's a fantastic park over near the Royal Children's Hospital that talks about now the Wurundjeri 7 seasons, that there weren't just 4 seasons. My son, he's only 2 and is a big part of my life, and I was looking out at the leaves, and I was going to try and explain to him that the leaves are going orange because it's autumn. But I realised it's not autumn. Autumn is some word that we have from the Northern Hemisphere. This has a name, and unfortunately I haven't learnt it yet, but I'm going to go out and try and learn that knowledge, that the name of this season is different here. There is different knowledge here that's relevant to this place. So Indigenous knowledge around place teaches us things about the world. And there is Indigenous knowledge about place that teaches us about where the animals should be, that when certain flowers are going to be blooming, that means that the eels are coming back. And the eels are going to be there, the baby eels are going to be climbing up the Hopkins Falls because it's that time of year. And then a certain period of time after that, we know from Indigenous knowledge that's when we can capture those eels. And that's when we can then smoke them and keep them and have them for food throughout the year. And we know that we can channel those waterways into specific places down in Lake Condah where we can take all that volcanic basalt and we can capture those eels. And it's that sort of knowledge about place that I think is a really critical part of Indigenous knowledge. The other things we know from around Indigenous knowledge to do with place are to do with the stories of those places. We know that there are places out in the landscape where people have been gathering for tens of thousands of years. And there's a place that my dad takes me down at Killarney Beach, down in Warrnambool. And you stand on this place, it's a midden. And for those who don't know, midden, it's just an Old English word for a rubbish dump. So really a midden is just, if you imagine going to the same place with your family, many members of your family, over generation upon generation and generation, and you eat shellfish, and when you finish with those shells, you just throw them away onto this pile. That's what a midden is. It's that accumulation of all those shells over all those thousands of years. And we have knowledge about these places. And when you stand on those places, you know that place. You know what has happened in that place to have all those people over so many years, so many generations coming to that place. That's Indigenous knowledge about place. We also know about places where there's ceremonies, where people have come and had important rituals that Gary was talking about before, where we had things happen at these places. And they're the different forms that Indigenous knowledge has around place. But we learn about these places now in many different ways. In the past, the way we got this knowledge as Aboriginal people was from listening from our elders and from hearing their stories. But they got it from listening to their elders, but also just from time. Time, I think, is one of the really key parts about Indigenous knowledge. The only way you learn that when this certain flower blossoms that the eels are coming here is from having watched that happen over generation upon generation and learning those patterns. It's that time it takes to learn that information. So in the past, it was about that time, and it was about passing on of that knowledge across generations. But I think today there are different ways of us learning that knowledge. There are ways that we can learn some information from books, and we can Google certain parts of information to get us some information. But from my experience, even as a younger man, I still think I'm a younger man, that knowledge that we find in books and from information only gets us so much information. To really understand a lot of things, you actually have to go to places, you have to be on the land and hear the stories at that place. And that's how you get Indigenous knowledge. You can look it up in books, and that's a good way to get an overview, but to really understand that knowledge, you have to go to the place, because it is about place. The other thing I'm really interested in is then how do we celebrate that knowledge? How do we kind of make that knowledge something we're all proud of and we all understand, and how do we use that? And Kerry mentioned this idea of caring for country. The Indigenous knowledge that we have around how to look after this place is huge. We don't survive here for 40, 50, 60,000 years by destroying the environment. Aboriginal people survived here because they knew how to look after this place. They knew that if you want a canoe, you don't go and chop down a tree and make a canoe. You just take from the tree the bits you need so you can make that canoe out of the bark, and the tree still gets to live. And there is so much knowledge out there that we can be using in everyday lives today to understand what is happening with the world, to go back and look at what's happening with those seasons. What's happening with where those animals are supposed to be based on traditional knowledge? What does that teach us about what we need to be doing now to fix those things, to put that system back into balance? Those are some of the key things around Indigenous knowledge that I think about in terms of place. And then as an architect, as a graduate architect, I think about how can we use place to help celebrate that knowledge. One of the key things, though, around that knowledge is about how do we do so in a way that gives that recognition to the Aboriginal people, because it is Aboriginal people's knowledge. I think it's great that we can all share in it, but we need to give that recognition and acknowledgement of whose knowledge it is, and we need to give that time. If you want that knowledge, if you want to share in that knowledge, you need to give time.
I've travelled a little in Central Australia, and I've seen young people there who have been sniffing petrol. It seems to me the most obvious thing on earth is to bring in opal petrol that they can't sniff. Perhaps Professor Kerry, maybe you could just tell me why that hasn't been introduced all over the place.
In a lot of the remote or regional areas around Alice Springs, that has been brought in, but that is again around where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have got the ability to control market forces that would determine that having only opal fuel available in a major transit city within a area like Alice Springs, it's not possible. And so what they do then is invest in programs to help people not start sniffing, so there's a lot of prevention work that goes on, or a lot of programs around rehabilitating people in that regard. It is an enormous problem. It's not a problem that's only experienced by Aboriginal peoples in Central Australia. It is common across disparate, desperate youth in all different cultures around Australia. But that is the major reason why they have been able to introduce that in lands where communities are in control, where they have got the governance, where they have got trust indeed, where they can make those decisions and that they're able to abide by it. But in certain areas where those market forces are too strong, you can't just have one product without having the range of different issues that come with that. I know, it's a shame.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Anybody else?
As someone who's involved in the Minimbar project, which is to do with the birth certificates, I'm interested in the panel's views about how we integrate identity and belonging into an essentially sort of white fella construct of legal identity, and how we do that in a way that not only engages Aboriginal people, but it engages us in the stories and the culture of this wonderful place.
Gary might want to comment before anybody else does. Gary?
Well, identity goes back to your connection to country, and the interesting thing about that in Victoria, because that's the place I know, is that back in 1968 to 1975, state government, Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, used to go around to people's houses and check their cupboards and steal their kids, but they also wrote down people's family trees. And they produced 400 pages of family trees of the principal families in Victoria. So that's the first body of information, besides their own personal birth, death and marriage records, which basically Aboriginal people didn't get access to until well into the native title processes. And from native title, from about 93 onwards to now, there's a huge body of connection evidence. A lot of stuff is held at Native Title Service Victoria, as it is at Public Records Office and Museum Victoria and other places, the Institute in Canberra and so on and so on. So what I'm getting to, I suppose, is that it's probably time to map traditional owner Victoria. We know who the principal families are. There's probably about 200. So are the Lovetts, the Harrisons, the Markses, the Murrays, the Nichols and so on and so on. We know that. So I think it would be a 2-year project, but we could map it. And once you map it, a child can get access to it, either through the internet, we probably have to have some process where there's some confidentiality and privacy, but we could map those families and kids would not have a problem with their connection. The only issue would be interstaters have now come here. A lot of we've got something like 5,000 Torres Strait Islanders, including this one here. And we've got a lot of interstaters from West Australia and South Australia. But I still think we need to do the exercise and get it done, get the family trees done and produce it, because it's a huge body of evidence that if it's tightened up and completed, that's the evidence you need for the question of fighting sovereignty and treaty and arguing the case. That we come from here, we're the First Nations, we're the first language, we're the first histories. And we need to keep boosting up the evidence to argue that case. And just on that petrol thing, it's pretty bad news when Australia can spend billions of dollars going overseas and fighting useless wars that we have nothing to do with, and they can't sort out this fuel thing. And that's an absolute indictment on Australia's human rights.
Would you like to comment?
I have had the opportunity to work as part of the group of people and supporting particularly Professor Jane Fremantle and the work that she's been able to do, and Melissa and the book that we're about to launch on the very important issue of being able to register your birth. It hasn't been done well across Australia, where you've actually got a birth that's registered and that the data linkage happens between mothers and fathers. And what we found through this project was really incredible, because people were asking the issue of Aboriginality, but they were only asking if the mother was an Aboriginal person. These two men and their children, if they'd been married to non-Indigenous women, and the Aboriginality of the mother was an answer no, then their children were denied their Aboriginality, because the question is not being asked in our hospital services about the Aboriginality of both parents. What we have found is that there is a significant underreporting of the number of Aboriginal peoples in Australia at the moment. And I think in Victoria recently, don't quote me on this, but you can go and look it up, but we've found an extra 7,000 Aboriginal children because someone bothered to do the linkage between the births and deaths and marriages registrar and the hospital data, and linked that together and said, actually, you know what, for the last 20 odd years we haven't asked about the Aboriginality of the father, we've only asked about the Aboriginality of the mother. Now, what that has in terms of implications for resourcing health services, educational strategies to make sure that everyone gets access to a good education, citizenship rights and responsibilities and opportunities that we often ask governments to fund properly, all of that is done on the basis of population. And if we're not capturing those stories well at that time in the way that this book is actually promoting, then we have missed out on an enormous opportunity, and we are under-resourcing Indigenous Australia. And that, I think, is another travesty, and one which I believe does have an impact on a human rights perspective, a health and opportunity perspective. And just a citizen, I'm a citizen of this, and I respect my father's Aboriginality, and I'm very pleased that I got counted in that way.
I thought it was a wonderful point you made about caring for country, caring for land, and how that's one of the key issues. And also the example that was given about learning from the changing of the seasons or the trees as to when you could harvest the eels. I wonder, is there a particular Indigenous problem-solving approach to problem-solving that you might want to comment on? Because goodness knows we need some new problem solving for some of the problems we've got.
Who'd like to comment? Rueben, you were talking about eels.
That's a slippery subject. I'll try and get it. I think in terms of problem solving, I think one of the things that the Aboriginal community itself does quite well to try and help solve problems is it doesn't presume that one person knows all the answers. I think that's one of the things that the Aboriginal community does quite well, is that it goes and talks to people and finds out what do other people know about this, and how can we all use our collective knowledge to find an answer to this problem. And I think that's a key value that we might be able to learn from Aboriginal people around solving problems.
Do you want to comment on that one too? It's actually a very important one.
Either of you?
I've got just a quick comment.
Kerry?
Indigenous knowledge is based on science. Okay, so what we have is a scientific framework, and it is different because it's not a reductionist scientific framework that's currently part of and underpins Western civilization as we know it at the moment. It didn't always do that, but that idea of being able to go and sorting out as a collective what our problems are. We are very, very skilled at working with complex issues, wicked problems, because you can't solve the problem with the kind of thinking that created it. We are able to work across different knowledge systems, and we hold all of those different knowledge systems. We understand they're diverse, but we hold them equal. And I think that just if everyone applied the ability to work in complex situations, acknowledged Indigenous knowledges as having a scientific, factual basis, that there are an extraordinary number of scientists who used to manage the eel traps, who did farming, who looked at the seasons, and that we had natural alignment with those different elements of problem solving, I think that we'd be a lot better off. Just to give value and validity to the sciences that we hold is a really critical part of engagement, and I don't think we really do that terribly well at the moment.
I'm a daughter of Italian migrants who came here to Australia in the 1950s, to your countries, to make it their country in this incredible myth of building the nation of Australia. They assimilated to the point where one of the first things my mother learnt about Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was they're bungs, they're dirty, and all the other offensive stuff. She had to unlearn that and pass on a very different legacy to us. I'm really interested in something that I feel hasn't been debated in so-called multicultural Australia, and that is the complicitness of various migrants who have come to your countries in colonialism. And if you can give us any feedback or any insights to people like me who want to work in that intersection and get multicultural communities to claim their complicity. I mean, I'm from a background where my father was picking weeds on the footpath, and now it's called Rocket Rugala, and it's selling for $50 or something. You know,
Another slippery problem.
I'm really interested in any light that you can shed. I think this is a debate that we still have to have in your countries.
Gary, would you like to comment?
I'm happy to deal with that. I grew up, I was born at Arabena on the island, real snake-type country and big dust storms and that, and we got flooded out in 1956. And we came to stay at Camp Pell, which is now Royal Park. Camp Pell was an American military base. Then we got shipped out from there to Glenroy, and we were the first house in Glenroy, the northern suburbs, and it was just paddocks. I never got bitten by a snake in Barrow, but I got bitten by a Wurundjeri snake in Glenroy. and I've got the scar to prove it. So, outside of the snake story, I love a snake story, I'll tell that now. I grew up with guys that were my best mates, Maltese guys and Italian guys, and I think Italians and Greeks and Maltese people and Aboriginal people survived together because we all copped it. We all copped it at school and we backed each other. And you know, if you call my mate a wog or I got called an abo, something would happen. There would be a discussion. This is a minor one, but there would definitely be a discussion. And so I've never ever sort of come across any sort of situation where migrants, what I call it, we're the first wave, the Europeans were the second, and then we got the migrants coming in the 40s and the 50s and that. I don't think they impacted us in a negative sense at all. I think we created relationships. We've had people like Alex Jacomos marrying an Aboriginal woman who's our aunt from Cumragunja, and he brought us into the Greek community through the 50s and the 60s. So it was a powerful relationship, but unwritten. Needs to be written up, that. It's a real powerful story.
And that might be the contribution that you make. I mean, who can forget Charles Perkins and what he was able to do with, you know, the mix of multicultural Australia? I think at one stage or other we all get othered from mainstream Australia, and it's not complicit. And I don't know if that's an appropriate word in this context. It is absolutely about having to be under the radar, because part of the migrant story has also had to be about being the same. You know, you've had to be the same in the same way and become invisible in that regard. And you've also had to other others so that you can look like you hold the centre space. There are some really fascinating stories coming out about critical whiteness and around racism and people's different experiences and exposures that has had. But I agree with Gary, we've got beautiful stories of togetherness and beautiful intersections. We've got, up in North Queensland, old Greek cane farmers with really strong connections to Aboriginal families, and then they had some. You know, like, I think that there is an unwritten story which is part of the Australian landscape. Even down at the Snowy Mountain River scheme, you know, all of the different cultures who helped build that, and all of the different relationships that we've had across our last couple of decades together, I think has been a very rich and powerful one.
you spoke a little bit about place, and I suppose recently with the William Barak building being built, there's been quite a lot of conversation within the Aboriginal community as well as the architectural community about, and also the landscape architectural community about the place that Aboriginality has within architecture and how they can come together. I suppose I'm interested in your opinion. Maybe you could speak a little bit about how Aboriginal sensibility can be used within architecture, and also maybe if you could speak a little bit about your thoughts on the William Barak building. I know that he's not your elder, but I guess whether you think it creates a good conversation or if it's not so good, and maybe you two could also say what you think about that as well.
Rueben.
Thank you. So I'll talk about the portrait building first, I think. And that was actually, when that got announced back in 2010 that it was happening, that was actually the catalyst for myself and Jeffrey Greenaway, the only actually registered Aboriginal architect here in Victoria. Because that project came out, we thought, well, they should have come to speak to us about that as Aboriginal architects, to think from a design perspective, is that the right thing to do? But we weren't out there for them to know to come and speak to us. So I thought we better form this organisation so they know that we're actually there to come and talk to about it. And I know there has been a lot of discussion around that building. And my personal view is that it's an interesting architectural approach to try and address that. But I'm not certain that having it on an apartment building is the most appropriate setting for it. I also think it's, from my own personal opinion, it's unfortunate that it seems that all the images we've seen of William Barak don't match what the building looks like. And I think that's something there's an attempt to try and rectify that, and I think that would be good. And that's a concern I have, is the discrepancy between that image and his actual, what we think of his face. In terms of broader design, though, I think it really is really fantastic that more architects are thinking about how to engage with Aboriginal culture, to have it as a part of their design. I think in the past, architects just thought about, well, if I'm doing an Aboriginal health service or a cultural centre, I need to think about Aboriginal design. But I think the more we can think about it on every project, and think about that place that you're building on is not a place that's got an empty slate on it. It's a place that's got 40, 50, 60, 100,000 years of history on it. How can you draw on that history? How can you work with the traditional owners of that place to say, are there any stories about this place that we can tell? And working with those people to be able to do that, I think there's a great opportunity to do that, to raise awareness with the broader community that these places exist, and to help celebrate that culture, to make it something that everyone who's there, who lives in that place, can be proud of, no matter what their background.
Thanks, Rueben.
I suppose it's good to talk about an image on a wall, on a building, even if the image is not the one that really should be there. And I think if we did a quick survey of Wurundjeri people, I don't think Marg would support that image. No, there you go. Kill that off. But I suppose what I want to tell you is we've just come out of a 6-year research study with the Land Justice Group, City of Melbourne, and the Faculty of Architecture at Melbourne Uni. And there's been about 4 or 5 publications done. It was about developing and scoping and building a Victorian Indigenous knowledge and cultural centre. Bottom line is, this meeting should be in that building. You should be able to come to that. Right. So, the bottom line is, we need $1 billion. We have to raise $1 billion and get the land, and it could come out of a native title settlement, maybe with Wurundjeri and Bunurong and all that, or it could come out of overseas investment. But a design and construct is what we need. Because the question is, where do you see us in the CBD? We're tucked away in the Heritage Trust around in Queen Street, which is moving to Federation Square for 5 years, only 5 years. But the sort of concept we're talking about is potentially 2 towers, Indigenous university in it, 1 business centre, 1 residential for tourism and the students, and so on and so on. All the sort of things we've talked about over a long time would go into this concept. And as soon as you walk down the street, and we're talking about on the Yarra River, opposite the casino, between Flinders Street and Spencer Street, with a new railway station in the middle, going through the building, that's the concept we're on about. and it's a multifunctional building that's owned by all the First Nations. It would be the main building that would be a satellite to the ones up at the Alps. They're going to build one up in the Alps, at Bright. They're going to build another one at Horsham. They're going to build another one probably down in Conda or wherever else. All the native title settlements include a building, a cultural centre, a resort, whatever. So those local ones, there's probably going to be 20 out there, spread throughout the state. But the main one should be here, because one reason. The population of Victoria is about 50,000 people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, about 5,000 CIs. There's about half that in the country and half in Melbourne. The people in Melbourne are never ever going to get any benefits out of a native title settlement or land justice stuff. So we see that building as belonging to those clans, those family groups, and they should reap the benefits. We're not into setting up big corporations like Gualo or whatever. We want this to be owned by traditional owners in every sense of the word. And that's the concept. And then we answer that question, where do you see us? You'll see us there.
Thanks, Gary.
My name's Tony Bright. I'm from Wagga Wagga. I'm a Wagga boy and now a Melbourne man. I'm involved in the men's shed movement, and a few years ago I moved to Melbourne and there was no men's shed. So I walked the streets for a couple of years to get some people together and some money and bring that concept, a country concept, to a city area. And we've got a men's shed now at Federation Square. But I wanted to ask Gary about your methods of sharing knowledge through men teaching men.
Okay.
It's sort of got some synergies with the men's shed.
We'll get an answer to that and we'll get to the next questioner. Thanks, Gary.
Well, if you've got $1 billion, and we'll build the biggest shed. We'll build you the biggest shed you ever seen. And all the men and the women are welcome to the place.
Thank you. My name's Catherine. 2 comments, really. One was about Aboriginal problem solving. There is a lovely place in Darebin Parklands, and I was very fortunate to be taken on that walk with an elder who's no longer with us, which it's a reclaimed land, but it looks as if it's always been there. And a process in a booklet where you sit on a rock and you think of a problem and you pluck a gum leaf and then you go to some ponds and you gaze into the water and you walk over a little bridge. It's a whole process of sort of personal meditation and consideration of a problem, which is really lovely. And the walk that I went on, which I guess was sponsored by the Darebin Council, there were 30 or 40 of us of all age groups and all ethnic backgrounds, and it was just wonderful.
Did you solve the problem?
Yes, I did. And I found my spirit companion, I'm not sure what the word is, in a meditation process. It was lovely. And the other is a comment about multiculturalism, in that I'm obviously the descendant of immigrants in the 1850s and the 1920s, and I don't think my ancestors had any idea they were coming to a country in which they were displacing the first people. And I used to work with adult migrants and refugees, and they was the last thing on their minds. They were looking for a safe place. But I considered it part of my responsibility to let them know you had no idea what this history was of this place you're in, but now you're here, and we all have to work out our own way of living with the past and looking to the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things I think that I'm really sad about is wherever I go, I see signs saying this is the site of the heroes of the Crimean War, this is the site of some colonial person in another war, another country, I don't mind the pre-19th century when we all fought together. However, we've got to change these names and get back to Indigenous names so people ask the question, what happened here? We have things like Waterloo, and we have things like the Crimean War. Nothing to do with Australia, and we need to get rid of those things.
There'll be a response from the panel about that, and Rueben might like to start, but I'm sure that everybody has something to say about that.
Well, I think I'll focus particularly on the place name part of it, and I think there is a lot of good work that is trying to be done, especially around the city of Melbourne, which I think is fantastic. I've been helping out with the Aboriginal Heritage Action Plan to try and work out how we can get more place names into the city of Melbourne. But there are, when you look around the suburbs, wherever you live, a lot of those places are going to be based on Aboriginal names. You might just not know it. So go out there. If there's a name that sounds strange, it's an Aboriginal name, learn what it is, tell other people about it.
And there's some fabulous work being done about the Wurrungan language as well, so you might want to pursue that. And there's apps coming out, and there's all sorts of conversations around that. Gary, did you want to say something?
It's a bit like that multicultural issue too. This game's about numbers. It's about relationships. And if you want to change stuff, you know, there's a process you've got to go through if the state government places names committee and all that. But if you've got people power, you can change it. It takes a while, probably a year or two, maybe longer. We had an instance of a mountain up in the Alps called Mount Niggerhead. Mount Niggerhead. Wonder who came up with that name. And I've got to say this too about that. Birth, deaths and marriages came in 1851, and a lot of our people got names, like Trollop, Kitty, after the white man's old cat, Jackie. And the point about that, I suppose, is how do we change those documents? Because they're birth, death, marriages from the 1850s. So I talk about contemporary birthing rights and the rest of it. But what about those terrible names that were out there that replace those beautiful tribal names? They need to come back. And our people got to take responsibility for that too. We've got to do the research and bring those names back. And some of those names are about that long, but that's okay. That's okay. But the kids these days, like some of my kids, they hyphenate their names. They take the mother's name and the father's name now. So they got long names.
That'd be a Lovett Murray, are we talking about? Is
that a football? One of them, Lovett Murray, Jackson Murray, they're all there. But just with name changes, and it's like anything. Local government in particular, they love alliances between Aboriginal people and multicultural groups. And the same thing with the state. If you want name changes, that's the level you've got to take it at. And that's really important. And we welcome that.
Kerry?
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting comment about knowing what happened here. And certainly at the University of Melbourne, there's the Billabillari's Walk. It's a self-walk app. And you actually kind of get a chance to reimagine the Carlton landscape without any buildings on it and just understand it from a different set of eyes. I think that's very powerful. I've also got some friends who've just relocated back up to Alice Springs and are working with people who are in rehabilitation from alcohol and drug abuse. And what they're doing now is actually training them to do walking tours for tourists around Alice Springs to talk about their own stories about what happened on this place. And they'll just take groups of 4 or 5 people around. But I actually thought that was an incredible innovation, because how often do you get a chance to make that level of connection with someone about what their story is of that place? We do it at Fitzroy really well with the art all over the wall, and you get graffiti artists walking you through and kind of having a very different visual history of Fitzroy and what that looked like. And I think if we extended that and thought about re-engaging young men and young women in telling the story of different places, they would have to learn something. We would have to listen deeply and sincerely, and I think that's a very good thing to talk about during Reconciliation Week.
Hi, I'm Angie. I'm an engineer and I'm from Gurungai country, born on the land of the Gurungai people. And I suppose the main way that people interact with Aboriginal communities is when there's a project and a development approval process. And I know it's quite different in New South Wales than Victoria. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on improvements on, being structured under a registered Aboriginal party, and getting your cultural knowledge shared and, valued in an engineering project.
You won't get a quick answer to that from this panel, I don't think. Could we take the question from the person up the back and just make sure that it's not the same sort of question? That person with his hand up, what did you want to ask?
It's not a question, if you allow me to speak for 2 minutes, because I'm a visitor. I am from Sydney, and we are from Marrickville Council, me and Councillor Chris Wood here. And we would like to give you some comments about naming the streets, the Aboriginal names, and tell you about the long history of working together in Marrickville, all the community in Marrickville, multicultural community, and white people, and in the 85,000 residents from different backgrounds. We speak 120 different languages, and we were the first, if you like, a piece of Australia to acknowledge the names of the street and restore some of the Aboriginals' name to some sites, and do what we have to do, which is encourage the Australians to be the first Aboriginal state member of.
Okay, thank you. I'll get this man who was asking the question about places to talk to you, and also Jeff, who's here from the City of Melbourne, and somebody might like to comment on either of those two observations.
No, just thank you. I think it's a really wonderful undertaking by a local council to make that kind of a determination. Congratulations and thank you and well done.
In response to the question.
I have a very quick comment around the question around engineering and the development that happens that actually triggers a lot of this research into place. And I think that one thing I would encourage people to do is not be limited by what the legislation says you have to do. Treat that as a minimum and say, well, actually, what should we do, not just what the law requires us to do. Yeah. That's what I'll encourage people to do.
I'll take that, Kerry, as your comment in response. And Gary, did you want to have the last word?
Oh, the last word. I love the last word. The Aboriginal Heritage Act 2006, Victoria's been going about, 8 years? And it's determined 9 registered Aboriginal parties in that time, 38 First Nations. So there's only 9, another, whatever to go. It's legislation that can be good in some parts, but is woeful when it comes down to the crunch between development and protecting and preserving our cultural heritage. Development will always win, because the state has the final say in it, in particular the Secretary of the Department of the Premiers and Cabinet. So from that point of view, it's not good legislation, and we're very careful of it. We've also got the Commonwealth Heritage Protection Act, so if you look at both of them together, it could work up to a point. But how you fix this, you need to resource it properly, and you need to recognise all the First Nations, not just 9 that happen to be related to the people who sit on the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, in most cases. It's very, what could I say, it'll be nice. It's got a lot of conflict of interest, and that's a fact, right? And we've actually got a letter in there asking the Minister to please explain how councillors are going to avoid that, because that is another problem. It's been a long-standing problem from day one. The council's made decisions about the Auty order, for example, that go across other people's country, and they won't rescind that, and we need to sort that out. There's other decisions that have been made where ancestors have been taken and put in another group's country when they should be in another one. We've got real serious problems with the Heritage Council.
And it's also a problem with the leftover from colonialism, Gary, yeah? Yeah.
I'll just have to say I have a different opinion from Gary on this, and that's fine. That I think that the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council does a very good job, partly because my dad is part of it. So I feel I should stand up and say...
That's what I meant about conflict of interest.
And to point out very clearly that no one who has a connection to any of the places ever decides on anyone else's country. So.
And you've heard it here tonight. And I have definitely got the wind-up. Can I say that I'd like us to thank the City of Melbourne for making it possible for all of you to be here. And the City of Melbourne for making it possible for all of you to be here, because this has been an extraordinary conversation.
Thank you. Well done.